Okay. Anyhow, welcome to our second presentation of the MGOI Winter Workshop webinar series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land from where I'm speaking that is rich in the history and traditions of many First Nations and Métis, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. This territory, governed by the Upper Canada Treaties, is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and adjacent to the Haldeman Tract. As gardeners, we gather on these treaty lands, recognizing our responsibility to honor, respect, and protect this land, its water, plants, and animals, and we acknowledge its traditional custodians. Tonight, we feature Kris Mahoney, who is the instructor / curator of integrated pest management at the Niagara Parks Botanical Gardens and School of Horticulture. After receiving his PhD from the University of Guelph, specializing in weed science, he has focused his time doing research and teaching. He has written over 20 peer-reviewed articles in various plant science journals and agricultural journals. Kris will continue the theme of plant evolution tonight, discussing various mechanisms that plants have evolved to create a vast array of phytochemicals to ward off attack. This is a fascinating topic. I cannot wait. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Again, our members are monitoring the chat for any issues that you may have, and please put your questions in the Q&A and Kris will answer after the presentation. So I think we should just get started.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. What I will say is that you guys are excited and I'm excited as well, because this is a topic that I have loved teaching for many years now. It's one of those things where the more you learn about plants and more specifically about the things that they can do, you sort of realize that there is there's such a fascinating interaction that plants have with the natural world around them. I'm going to try to build on a little bit of what Daryl was talking about in some of his presentation. So for tonight and for my next presentation afterwards, my title is cheekily named Better Living Through Phytochemistry. And just to date myself a little bit, that is a take on of a slogan that the DuPont Chemical Company used to have between the 1930s and up to about the 1980s, better things, better living through chemistry. And what I want to talk about is how plants have figured out how to live in somewhat of a hostile world towards them. And I have this picture on the front part of my slide here is an up-close picture of really what encapsulates my talk for tonight. And that's the stinging nettle that you see right through here. So if anyone has ever bumped up against a stinging nettle, ultimately what you have run up against is a specialized series of outgrowths of the epidermal cells, trichomes, if you will, that project off of the stem, and they are essentially like hypodermic needles. And inside those little hypodermic needles, it is stopped up with almost like a little stopper that you see through there. And it contains a cocktail of ingredients that can make people more or less miserable by running into those types of things. And I'll sort of focus in on formic acid. It's just an example. Formic acid is the same type of thing that the same type of chemical that ants use when they're trying to communicate. And when you get a run into with ants that are particularly nasty, it's the formic acid that you bump into. So for my talk tonight, what I wanted to do is I want to sort of pose this sort of concept, this sort of thought question between plants and insects, and sort of something we'll hit on here in the front part, and something that we'll talk a little bit about towards the very end, as we'll sort of the concept of, do we feel like insects, are they a friend, are they a foe, or are they maybe some sort of frenemy somewhere in between? And one of the things that will sort of encapsulate that sort of discussion is these sort of questions that we're gonna look at in some way, shape, or form. And we acknowledge that the relationship that plants have with the outside world is that they are a producer of materials, of sugars. And because they are a producer, then there's going to be consumers. And one of those consumers that we concern ourselves with are obviously insects. And they're going to be regularly causing losses no matter what we do. And so we will probably have to examine in some way, shape, or form, how are insects doing the types of damage. And there's definitely some things that we'll sort of view as far as how plants can potentially recognize types of damage. And then once they recognize that damage, then what do they have, some tools in their own toolbox that they can use to ultimately defend themselves? And what we'll sort of touch on as we kind of go through here is that this is not a sort of a one-way street here. There is a give and take. These are relationships that have been evolving, have been developing for millions of years. And so whatever a plant potentially will do, then a herbivore, insects or whatnot, will have to figure out some way to cope with what the plants have done. And it kind of is this sort of cycle that goes back and forth, around and around, as the sun chases the moon across the sky. And then lastly, is if we think about the losses that our plants are coming under, is that, well, maybe plants can sort of reach out and try to find some other mutualistic relationships, some interactions that potentially can help them along the way. And we'll kind of touch on those in a couple different examples. So what we have for tonight is that I'm really only going to focus on bullet point 1 and bullet point 2. Bullet point 3 and 4, different alliances I will allude to, but that's a whole other topic in and of itself. And I promised I would focus on insects and diseases for these 2 nights, and tonight's is going to be insects and the next night is going to be diseases. So we are going to sort of have the framework is that plants have been interacting with some type of herbivore. It started out as some sort of insect type creature for at least 400 million years. And so we have a long-term relationship between these herbivorous insects and the plants that are representing the resources that they want to potentially tap into. And so we're going to frame that sort of relationship as basically a conflict of interests. And that one of the most basic conflicts is going to be what those insects are doing, herbivory, the damage that they're potentially doing. Then we will sort of look at, well, what are ways that plants can fight back, and what are ways that insects and other herbivores have fought back and retaliated from the original offensive. And we will sort of break those interactions, that sort of conflicts, into things where you have defense mechanisms that are constitutive, so things that are always present. So it's an investment, it's a resource that's invested in protection. And then there's induced defenses. So these are things that are manufactured as needed. And then we will talk a little bit more towards the back part of there is, what are classically thought of as secondary metabolites that are used in plant defense. And some of these topics within these constitutive defenses or induced defenses, or maybe in some of these secondary metabolites, they do spill over into relationships that are established between enemies of the plant's enemies. And, we can kind of touch on those briefly today, but we'll have to sort of save that for another time. So one of our sort of frameworks that we're going to be looking at here is just an example of, a microcosm of a long-term and complicated relationship. And I have a sort of the framework here of the relationship between tobacco hornworm, which is in the same species as our tomato hornworm. So if you kind of recognize some of the generalized shapes that we see there, you probably recognize this old friend. And obviously with the tobacco hornworm, it has evolved a long-term relationships with wild tobacco. And, basically, if we sort of look at our individual frameworks that we sort of set out, is that this conflict arises because as a hungry herbivore, they're going to need something to sustain them. They are looking at food and food resources, and plants are going to be providing those types of things. So what can wild tobacco do in this, for instance, or, sort of any other plant, as we sort of look at this example, is that, well, they can potentially form alliances with the enemy of their enemy. So, here we have in the picture through here, we have our tobacco hornworm has eggs laid upon it. So some sort of parasitoid has potentially attacked here this larva, and eventually eggs will hatch and consume this caterpillar, and therefore protecting the wild tobacco. Now, obviously, that Alliance 2 is sort of hitting on, especially when we see at the end of our presentation today, is that we'll sort of touch on the fact that wild tobacco can't be super successful with what it's doing, because ultimately at some point, those tobacco hornworm larvae have to finish their life cycle, become an adult, so that they can actually serve as a pollinator for wild tobacco. And so now you can kind of see this sort of different sort of alliance that is formed. And that's, obviously is something that we're quite familiar with, is the role that insects play as potential pollinators. So what we'll do is we'll sort of look at this individual framework, and we'll sort of revisit it towards the end. So as I sort of touched on from the front end of our outline, is that to kind of, again, spring off of some topics that Daryl has been looking at, is that we could sort of view that plants and insects have been in a long-standing dance of coevolution, as we see right through here. And so if we sort of roll back the clock 400 million years ago, that you can still even see that there was evidence of herbivory going on. So I have this coprolites that we have over here on the far left-hand corner of the screen. Those are fossilized insect poop, and within those fossilized insect poop represents plant material. Obviously, different plants than what we see for today. The topic of some of Daryl's talks is more focusing on the angiosperms and those types of things. But ever since plant life had emerged and evolved and developed, there has been some aspect of an insect that has been interacting with them, whether it's eating the leaves or eating parts of the leaves or consuming nectar that was present as an enticement for pollination as we move through. So what we see is that plants and insects have been doing this a long time, and they've had to figure out a way to get along, or at least sort of maintain a little bit of a status quo, if you will. And obviously there's examples that you've probably heard me talk about where the status quo is disrupted when you have an invasive insect. And here we're really talking about, some of those long-term relationships. So the long-term relationships, this ongoing conflict of herbivory, is really sort of focusing on several different types of consuming of the products. So we're looking at potentially extracting nutrients from the phloem, and aphids are an example of those. We have some insects that are going to be chewing the entire leaf, and we have that in the lower left-hand corner. We have leaf miners that are just sort of grazing on and sort of nibbling between the individual surfaces of the leaf. We have mites that are sort of doing rasping and sucking type activities, and we also have nematodes that are sort of attacking root tissues, as you sort of see through there. And again, all this sort of stems at the fact that in this sort of dog eat dog world that we live in, you are either going to eat plants or you're going to eat something that eats plants. And our insects are sort of really no exception to that sort of rule. So what we'll sort of touch on for today is that plants, what we'll come to find out is that they do differ, and they respond differently to different types of feeding behavior. So as an example, so our leaf chewing insects, yes, they're going to be causing extensive damage and wounds to our potential plants, but it's ultimately for some of those insects, it's that sort of damage and the mode of how that damage occurs, and sort of how insects ultimately are consuming that material, is that they, much like a cow, have to sort of chew on some of that leaf material, pre-process it a little bit, regurgitate, let it sort of partially digest on the outside, and then sort of go at it again. And plants can sort of figure out, oh, something's going on because I perceive this sort of regurgitated regurgitated product that I have receptors for. Or you could be looking at something like our aphids and those types of things, and the resources that are being extracted from aphids and those types of insects is hard won. And so because that resources like phloem sap and those types of things are sort of rich in sugars and those types of things, the plant's going to really want to try to make sure that it's not losing some of those hard gained materials. So ultimately, what is the plant doing? Well, as I sort of mentioned, that the plant can have what you consider as its first line of defense, our constitutive defenses, things that are always there. And obviously, since this is a discussion of measures and countermeasures, we're going to also have to examine what the herbivore is doing. So as an example, we could be looking at things like resin or latex. And we could sort of think about, like, for some plant material, our mulberry that we see in through here, or there's, some of our pines and firs and spruce and those types of things, that they're going to be producing resin. And we can think about that approximately 10% of plants, of angiosperms, have some sort of capacity for production of resins or latex or those types of things. And you can kind of think of it as that it's really akin to the plant version of venom. Not every snake is going to be venomous, but there are some that are. And so because of these defenses that are always going to be there, as you can see this for this articulated lactifer that you see for mulberry, these are just simply cells that are existing within the leaf that have this sort of cocktail of materials, this latex, which its whole intention is to firm up and to plug up holes and damage that occurs. But then you could have plants that are producing this latex, and then you will have some insects that have figured out a way to get around them. And I have this picture of the taro leaf beetle, and we'll sort of show a little bit about a little later on. Well, what are those guys doing? You can see those little hash marks, that little trench that you see right through there. And what is that guy doing? Well, it's a countermeasure, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. So for our plants, we should acknowledge that plants and the tissues that they contain will ultimately vary quite a bit in how little or how much defense is being put up at any given time. So we'll sort of look at sort of two concepts. We'll look at lifespan and we'll look at nutritional value. For lifespan, we can generally sort of think about is that there is a fundamental difference between our short-lived ephemeral plants and the investment that they have to defense versus something that's going to be a little bit more long-lived. Those long-lived species are going to have to exist in a world that you're looking at sort of a regular infestation or a regular sort of attacks, if you will, if we're going through time. Whereas, maybe our more short-lived species, they just kind of have to get by just enough and then get themselves off to their reproductive phase, and then they're mostly done. Now, for our nutritional value, as we sort of touched on a little bit when we talked about our aphids and the hard-won materials that the aphids are removing. Well, I mean, you have to sort of realize that plants are going to be putting up defenses against material that it values. And that value could be associated with the types of nutrients that are packed into it. Generally speaking, the reason why herbivores are consuming material is that they're trying to extract the resources out of it. And they sometimes preferentially go for those nutrient-rich material. Well, plants have to sort of figure out, well, what's the best thing that we can do to try to prevent herbivores. And so for things like seeds, for apricots and apples and those types of things, they contain toxin, amygdalin, excuse me. And amygdalin, as you see in this particular compound through here, has a very interesting component in it. If I can circle my little arrow right there, that's this little compound right through here. That CN is C, a carbon triple bonded to a nitrogen, and that is a precursor for cyanide. So tissues that are of high value can contain a little surprise for some of our herbivores, and essentially a deterrent, if you will, like, please stay away from my material. This is a graph that kind of shows that this sort of concept about how tissue defenses can vary, and this is varying through time. And just briefly walk you through these two points on here. We're talking about the difference between the amount of cyanide concentration that can be found in black cherry, or specifically black cherry leaves, and also sorghum, which is a grass really similar to something like corn. And so what we see is that there is, when there's a high leaf nitrogen content and also a high water content, it typically represents those early parts of development. So you can see that for our sorghum, seedling sorghums that you see right through here are going to have a high concentration of cyanide. And as this plant matures, it has to invest less and less in protecting its overall leaves. Because if you think about an annual like sorghum, it's going to be allocating resources towards the end of its life cycle towards seed production. And so the need for having a high parts per million of cyanide really goes down as this plant develops. Same thing that we see for our black cherry tree. So in and around this time through here of bud break, and through sort of mid-May that you see through here into July, this is sort of timed very similar to what we'd see for when some of our caterpillars, some of our hungry larvae are going to be out looking for a nutritious, nitrogen-filled meal. Well, the risk here is that, you know, you're going to have to sort of put up with pretty high amounts of protection that's been built into those leaves that tends to go away and become less nutritious as that plant ages out and those leaves start to drop and senesce in October. So you can kind of see that's for some of our defenses that there is a you know, sort of a time window where things are more or less protected. So let's look at some of these ways that plants protect themselves. And so we can look at sort of three evolved processes. We can look at physical defenses, we can look at chemical defenses, and then we could look at a combination of those. And so obviously for our physical defenses, as gardeners, we're well aware of those frontline protective thorns or spines, or even some, you know, trichomes, those types of things that are going to keep us away from mucking around with a plant too much. But once you can get past those sort of physical defenses, there's potentially the chemicals that have been manufactured. And in some cases, as our first picture of the slide of the night for our nettle, is that nettle is an example of having both types of defenses, you know, having these sort of physical protection of having an enlarged trichome and then having some sort of chemical constituent on the inside of it. So let's look at some of those frontline defenses. You know, we can look at, you know, thorns, we can look at different trichomes, we can look at the actual cell walls and wax, that waxy cuticle layer really on the covering of that plant. And then just to the inside, as we sort of touched on with those lactifers and those types of things, there's probably going to be some of those reservoirs for latex or resin. I mean, these are physical defenses. These are constituent defenses that are always there. And some are more successful and some not so successful. And, you know, it has a lot to do with that individual balance as far as, you know, what our pests have potentially evolved to get around. So let's look at one of those examples. And this is an example from a plant is a desert plant called blazing star. Sometimes it's also called stickleaf. And this has a particularly aggressive set of trichomes. And again, remember, trichomes are just really extensions of epidermal tissue. So these are just basically growths off of the epidermis from that plant. And for a lot of insects, trichomes can be particularly lethal. These are electron microscope pictures of insects that have been impaled and stuck onto the blazing star. And as you can see, when you look at those hooks and those barbs at the top of this trichome over here, if you sort of focus over here, and I should say that this arrow should be a little bit over more here, it's kind of shifted a bit, but that red arrow is supposed to point at this right here, which is basically a tear in the chitin of an insect. And so if you were looking at something that is breaking the shell of an insect, breaking that sort of armored covering, yeah, that for sure that trichomes can be particularly nasty. And this happens to be one of the nastiest examples that I could come up with. But, you know, all is not lost for our friends, the insect. Sometimes they have figured out ways to get around these trichomes. So you could have insects with very long legs, as an example, that rise above trichomes and just basically avoid them. And so you can kind of see that with the stilt bug that's illustrated down through at the bottom of the screen. Or you just simply have the sheer force of will. So you could have sort of claws and sort of leg and foot parts that grab onto trichomes, that hold on to them, and just simply push past. And in that sort of grabbing motion are just sort of generating the force to just simply brush past them. And if they happen to also have some nonstick coatings with them, then they can just simply sort of push past that material. And so even though that's frontline defense of having trichomes, well, it depends on the insect if they're going to be trapped in it, or are they going to rise above it, if you will. Now, for some of our insects, they can maybe take more of a active approach. Here's some examples of insects that have mounted counterattacks to the trichomes that are produced. And so here's an example through here is the passion flower, the passiflora. The passion flower has some trichomes that have a particularly hooked tip to it, as you see right through there. But one of passion flower's potential sort of partners in the world is this zebra longwing. And what the zebra longwing can do is a couple different things to actively try to counter what's going on with the production of these hooked trichomes. Well, you can see that here's some pictures that show the trichomes that are essentially lashed back into or onto the leaf surface and tied down, so they're no longer sort of bothering insects that run by. Or, as you can see, that we see right through here for this designation right there, is that this was a trichome that had its tip nipped off. So actively going against some of those measures that have been put out by our passiflora, our passion flower, and simply going after it on the counterattack. So our insects are pretty wily in those kind of cases. For other insects, they could be succumbing to some chemicals that are inherent within those trichomes. So here we have some examples of tomato and wild potato. There are trichomes here that are producing or have chemicals on the inside of it that are releasing repellents. Some of those could be just simply to chase off the whiteflies as they're settling for a new home, or trip some of the natural alarms that are signaling to plants, or signaling to the insects, I should say, that there's a potential enemy on the nearby. And so effectively trying to chase them away and those types of things. Or a chemical deterrent that's sort of built into that, those trichomes could be trichomes that have a sticky or a sweet substance. And we sort of talked a little bit about some of those sticky substance that can be countered by a nonstick surface if the insect has that. But maybe they couldn't resist. Maybe insects don't have the ability to resist a sweet treat. Here we have some examples of our tobacco hornworm. And one of the first meals that a tobacco hornworm has once it hatches is to go for a quick, easy, sugary snack. And so there are licking essentially some of the sugars that are present on some of those trichomes. And I sort of have the lick'em stick or the fun dip, which is very similar, where you're sort of licking off that sugary bits off of a stick surface, again, to sort of date myself as far as the kind of candy I used to go for. Now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on your point of view, is that this comes with a cost, is that some of those sticky sugars give off or have a particular smell to it. And one of the natural enemies of our tobacco hornworm is going to be the rough harvester ants, which initially will find more success by finding some of these freshly hatched caterpillars, which have that sort of sugary smell about them. So an effect is that this first meal that these caterpillars have almost sort of mark them for being hunted later on. So again, you can see measures and countermeasures. All right. This is where I was talking about for that, the taro leaf beetle. And we are familiar with species that produce a milky latex, milkweeds and those types of things. But here our insects are actively trying to avoid the latex that's produced. So here we have the trenching that was being done by our taro leaf beetle here down in the lower corner. Here is that sort of that biting trench that they had, effectively making that latex exude as it would, but then it effectively eats elsewhere because that latex has been exuded, and they can have that sort of munch, that little meal right through here. The milkweed leaf beetle that you see right through here is a little bit more trickier, effectively snipping off, cutting the brake lines, if you will, of our milkweed plants, so that the lactifers don't have the ability to deliver the latex to get to that particular insect. And then after making those surgical strikes, has the ability to have an easy meal that we see right through here. So for all intents and purposes, the latex was working as it should, but the insect in this case was able to get around that. So we've talked about our constituent defenses, the defenses that are always there, that are always present. But there are defenses that are induced. So these are things that are triggered after an alarm has gone off. Like, so what is our plant doing to perceive that particular danger? And ultimately, what's some of the countermeasures that our insects have sort of figured out? And it's really easy to sort of conceptualize the perception of touch by a plant, especially when we think about like the mimosa, the sensitive plant that we sort of featured through here. And, that is a defense mechanism against a herbivore. I mean, you probably don't think of yourself as being a particularly skittish herbivore, but if you were to brush up against a plant that all of a sudden started moving quite quickly and moving away from you, for some of our more sort of fearful herbivores, mammals and those types of things, that they would probably sort of move away from those types of things. And so that sort of detection of movement, that sort of induced response, is kind of where we're looking at our sort of next sort of topic. So for our plants, is that they have to be able to figure out what is going on with their world around them. And, we'll sort of couch these in terms of, perceiving some sort of type of herbivory, whether it's the bites that are occurring from a hungry caterpillar, just sort of damaging tissue, or it's the piercing and the sucking and the removing of nutrients from a plant from something like an aphid. Or maybe it's the regurgitated products of that plant that has already gone through some pre-digestion, or maybe it's even the damage that's done by the egg-laying process and the threats of oncoming herbivory. Well, what we have in the plant world is a whole host of products that will ultimately ring the alarm. And we have califerin, which is typically associated with grasshoppers. We have inceptin and we have volatile. With inceptin and volatile, these are compounds that are probably the direct result of some type of direct consumption of plant material. And then that plant ultimately perceives that and triggers more responses later on. So let's focus a little bit on volaticin. Volaticin is a herbivory specific compound. And basically it is the product of fatty acids that are within our plant and amino acids that have been present in the gut of an insect. And so what we have is that the plant-derived linoleic acid in this case joins up with glutamine, an amino acid from our insect. And then after that plant material has been consumed inside the gut of our insect, as you see right through here, they will eventually regurgitate those plant tissues out and sort of does some of that pre-digestion process. Again, as we sort of said, much in the same way that like a cow does some regurgitation to kind of process those materials a bit more. For some of our insects, the reason why they do those types of things is sometimes related to, helping to process some potential toxic compounds that we see in here, that they sort of allow those materials to sort of get dissipated outside of them as opposed to inside of them. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. But anyway, these fatty acid conjugates that we see right through here, these sort of mashing together of materials, ultimately starts a chain reaction of responses. And what we sort of see right through here with this flow chart here is that there are specialized receptors for those fatty acid conjugates, that once that plant perceives that this is present, that is the signal that it's actively getting munched on. And it starts a whole sort of cascade of reactions that ultimately is the response of defense mechanisms. And so what you kind of see right through here is that there is the turning on of certain phytohormone genes. Those phytohormone genes are eliciting a response to sort of produce certain plant hormones. Those certain plant hormones trigger materials to be transcribed that ultimately sort of lead to the production of defense compounds. And so it's that sort of signaling process that gets underway by that perception of the damage that's occurring by that plant. So those sort of induced defenses are, they are basically mediated by some type of hormone, and some hormones that are particularly important for those responses are jasmonic acid, ethylene, salicylic acid. These are hormones that are starting to kick into different types of signaling. So they are signaling either direct responses, so those production further down the line, the manufacturing process of toxins, or they are allowing for indirect signaling. So it's like, well, we are not actively putting up a defense. We are actively signaling that we require help. And then hopefully the natural enemy, the predator of that particular insect, is going to be coming in because it's the signal like, hey, there's a ready meal right here waiting for you. So for these, these defense mechanisms that are either direct or indirect defenses, they are either acting locally or they have the potential for acting systemically. So sort of moving out from that plant, different parts of the plant, even moving off of that plant. So for something like our local signals that we see through here. So here are going to be those sort of direct responses that are elicited to put up toxins right away for those plants. And so this is probably going to be some sort of immediate electrical signaling that is occurring that will sort of signify to that particular plant, now's the time to start ramping up defense mechanisms and sort of getting that manufacturing underway to sort of stave off further defenses. But what ends up happening is that those defense responses move out to other parts of the plant. And so that's what some of those arrows are sort of indicating on our planter here, is that the damage is occurring on one leaf, the leaf that's being actively consumed. But in other leaves, you have defenses that are kicking on a little bit later. So they're sort of priming that those particular leaves, like, hey, start ramping up some of your defenses. They're not going to be as strong. They're going to occur a little bit later on because they're not some immediate, but at least they're sort of getting ready. Like, well, we're under attack and there's more things that we need to do to sort of beef up our defenses. Or some of those indirect defenses could be some volatile compounds. And so these are plant-derived volatile compounds, volatile chemicals that go into a gaseous form. And so those defenses start kicking into place, and they can start releasing some of the defense mechanisms outside of that plant. And we sort of feature some of those things that we have in here. We have the attracting of natural enemies, either predators or parasitoids or those types of things. Maybe we have other sort of natural enemies that are sort of active within the soil, as you can see right down here for the insect parasitizing nematodes. Maybe we have some compounds that are putting out repellents for the females of that particular plant. Or for some of these volatile compounds, they could be simply alerting neighborhood plants that danger is nearby. And for those neighboring plants, they don't even necessarily have to be of the same species. Those particular plants are what they refer to as being primed. And those, interestingly enough, those primed plants are sort of getting themselves ready for oncoming attacks. And plants that have been primed have been shown that they pass on this sort of need for defense, or this readiness defense, onto next generations. And further generations down the road tend to have more elevated protection that they kind of see there. They're kind of almost sort of, we're almost ready for an attack that's going to be coming later on. So here's some examples where some insects, okay, they're not insects, they're spider mites, so they're not exactly insects, but we'll sort of use them as herbivores. Is that here's some examples here where herbivores have done the dirty work of suppressing those induced responses. And so here we have our two-spotted spider mite over here, and here we have the red tomato spider mite that we have right through there. By itself, the two-spotted spider mite, if it's active on our tomato, starts kicking or starts allowing that tomato to kick in some of its defense mechanisms. And two-spotted spider mite can be somewhat of a moderate pest for these plants. But for our red tomato mite that we see right through here, this is a particularly devilish one, because this is a more nasty one, because this spider mite ultimately suppresses some of those natural defense mechanisms and therefore becomes more of a serious pest. When these two guys are working together, they ultimately increase the fitness of the other. So our two-spotted spider mite that we have right through here now becomes much more of a serious pest. And I have included some examples of these sort of spider mites sort of doing their nastiest on a tomato plant that we see right through here. All right, there we go. So ideally for our defense mechanisms, plants try to synchronize their defenses to the circadian rhythms of a natural time of insect attack. And that's kind of what we see right through here for our cabbage looper. And so that cabbage looper is going to be going through periods of whether it's going to be feeding or not. And if that plant can synchronize its defenses with that, it leads to less successful cabbage loopers. But if there's an asynchronicity, if the cabbage looper gets its circadian rhythm and shifts it just a bit, and we get a non-synchronous interactions, what we end up seeing is caterpillars become much more successful. And as see that represented by, by our more fat caterpillars that we see right through here. Now, there are some instances where, sort of plants can more take the lead. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the very end today, where plants can get out of sync with some of the insects that they are associated with. And it's to some of their successes. So if we think about these defenses, and we'll kind of think about a summary slide, is that some of these defenses are local, some are systemic. And we can have molecules that can move within the plants, and that we can have molecules that are gaseous, that are volatile, that contribute to a systemic response in other parts of the plants, but then also to other plants. Plants have the need to typically coordinate some of their responses and typically try to get those coordinated responses to the insect that is particularly attacking them. And then we also have to sort of consider that even if a plant has been attacked, is that we have the concept of tolerance priming, that it ultimately sort of readies defense mechanisms later on down the road for subsequent generations. So we have some abilities to, sort of plan for the future. All right. So the next sort of general topic that we're going to be looking at is that we're going to be looking at, some of the defense mechanisms that are extruding a cost to our plants. And these are things that we, is the topic that we really want to look at here, is those defense chemistries. Now, Beaker, as you can see on here, is quite shocked to sort of realize that plants can produce over 100,000 different compounds. And many of these particular compounds, as Bunsen is pointing to, function in some manner of plant defense. And that's really the cool thing about plants, is that sort of ability to generate a whole host of chemical compounds. So what do they do? Well, a lot of these compounds, they sort of fall into a realm of secondary metabolites. Now, just to kind of orient yourself a little bit to what we see right through here, in the center of this sort of bullseye, we have photosynthesis. And photosynthesis drives what we think of as the primary metabolites: sugars, amino acids, lipids, those types of things, all of those types of building blocks for our plants. All of our plants that go through photosynthesis are going to go through some sort of carbon metabolism, or nitrogen metabolism, or some sort of primary manufacturing. But on this outer ring, we have some of these secondary metabolites. We have compounds that are doing a whole host of things that we'll sort of talk about, either to defend the plants or to attract other insects to that plant. And they typically are restricted to certain members of the families. And so we can kind of think about some of those guys as we sort of go through here. So for those secondary compounds, what they could be looking at is compounds to either attract pollinators or predators or parasitoids. And, we sort of talked about on the front end with this sort of concept of those alliances, alliances that a plant could make to the enemy of their enemies, alliance number one, or make an alliance towards a pollinator. That's alliance number two that we see on there. And what we are interested in for our sort of discussion here today is, particularly, what's going to be causing some of those alarm mechanisms that set the alarm bells off that our plants are trying to protect themselves. Now, I do want to sort of slide in through here as far as this sort of concept is that you can have some cheaters to the game through here. So we kind of talked about this sort of concept of the production of volatile chemicals, and some of those volatile chemicals can sort of induce defense mechanisms, as we talked about. They can signal predators or parasitoids to come on in for help. But what you can have is that you have to sort of realize is that these alliances, either Alliance 1 or Alliance 2 that we talked about, is that they're fragile. And there's been some documented cases of cabbages which cry wolf. They cheat. They send out alert chemicals, these volatile compounds, even if they have a low amount of herbivory pressure. And what ends up happening is that in the short term, they get the gains by having their parasitoids come into the rescue. But in the long term, in this sort of fragile alliance that has been struck through here, is that the cry wolf basically means here is that those parasitoids don't want to get fooled. They don't want to get sort of brought into a warning from cabbages that we've been under damage if there's nothing to lay their eggs on. And so they become less sensitized to those particular responses. And ultimately, hopefully the cheaters never prosper. But there is some of those instances where, you can game the system, but, it is a sort of fragile balance between, the lying and potentially getting away with it. So for those compounds that are produced, some of those compounds are either toxic, they can be converted to toxins, or they are compounds that don't offer nutrients to what's consuming them. And I've just sort of captured a little bit here in this sort of slide through here. So cyanide glycoside is an example of something that is converted to a toxin. So this little triple bonded nitrogen and carbon right through here can ultimately become cyanide, as we sort of touched on from defense previously. Other compounds like nicotine is an effective insecticide. It is a toxin, and the toxin is relative to the overall dose. But you could have the instances where you have antinutritive compounds, which basically sort of slow down the success rates in herbivore feeding. They interfere with digestion, they interfere with their normal development. And, we see this, pretty often. Remember we talked about our discussion earlier of sorghum and how it's protecting itself much less as the sorghum matures, and that sorghum leaf drops off, the cyanide level drops off in a sorghum leaf. Well, the same thing is also happening in sort of internally and conceptually, is that as that sort of plant is maturing, less and less of the plant material is ultimately digestible. And so you can kind of see right through here is that as those plants mature, they become less digestible. There's a lot more plant material, but herbivores have to work a lot harder to extract resources out of it. Well, what's kind of happening with those antinutritive compounds? Well, some of that maturation process occurs for the production of a number of different compounds. Just as a side note, that sort of mature tissue is loaded up with lignin, and lignin is a feeding deterrent. Lignified tissue is not very nutritive. It's hard to break down. And, as an example of our cows as a herbivore, it has a hard time sort of breaking down lignified tissue and, has to sort of, use bacteria in its one of its stomachs to help break down some of that compounds. Other sort of things that we sort of see featured through here as antinutritive compounds would be things like tannins. So tannins can bind to resources inside the body of a herbivore and effectively make it so that it slows down the uptake of resources. So you can see right through here that tannin is binding to a protein through here, or to a glucose molecule that we have right through there. And typically what we see is that immature fruits, as an example, are loaded with tannins. And those tannins are there just simply as a protective measure, is that, that sort of puckery bite you have when you have an apple that's not mature. That's that plant telling you, stay away from this. I want you to stay away until that apple has time to mature. And, animals sort of learn to not consume those really tart, astringent materials because of the tannins that are produced in there. And the last sort of antinutritive compound I want to talk about is also very tricksy, is that, as we sort of mentioned on the front end, is that our insects or herbivores or whatnot, the reason why they're eating plants and plant material is that they're trying to extract resources out of it. And one of those resources are amino acids that they need for themselves. Well, there are some plants that ultimately create what's referred to as a non-protein or a fake amino acid, so that they make materials that, for all intents and purposes, are recognized as being the real deal. But once they're incorporated into proteins in a herbivore, they become less successful, and growth rate and productivity slows down if they're sort of consuming some of these materials through here. So there are a whole different host of ways that sort of plants can try to stave off herbivory in some of those cases. And if they can't sort of stave it off, well, then they have some of these toxins, and we'll sort of touch on those a little bit. Now, since this is a balance between, successes by plants and failures by insects and those types of things, we should acknowledge that for, some of these secondary metabolites, that insects have a way to deal with them. At least certain ones do. And tolerance to certain toxins kind of comes in a couple different forms. Either they are degrading those materials. So that would be an example, sort of munching on those materials, throwing them up and letting them sort of break down before you sort of process them in the body. They could be sequestering them, so much in the same way a tannin does, to stick on a molecule onto that particular toxic chemical and sort of store it away. Or it could be sort of excretion, just simply push it out much more quickly. And so you don't even have the process to even sort of have it sort of used within that particular insect. And generally, the some of the ways that insects have this ability to sort of develop this particular tolerance is that you kind of think about that a insect has certain receptors, and certain, let's say, enzyme receptors, if you will. And if we have a particular toxin, they're going to be targeting that and binding to it. BT is the classic example of that. So our Bacillus thuringiensis, it is the BT that we use as home gardeners is ultimately a soil-derived crystalline substance that there's receptors in the guts of insects. And that BT crystal binds to those receptors in the guts of our insects and effectively punches holes into the guts, and effectively, it causes sepsis and they die. Well, if those spots for binding are modified, the lock is changed. The key no longer fits in here. And that sort of target is sort of no longer targeted, if you will. All right, so let's kind of look about sort of three major groups of these sort of secondary metabolites, these sort of outside components. And we can think about them as sort of the larger groups of phenolics, terpenoids, and nitrogen-containing compounds. So first up, we're going to look at phenolics and terpenes. And these represent a wide range of things that could be medicines, they can be insecticides, or they can be irritants. And, there are terpenoids that you are probably very familiar with. Just as examples, like you have a lemon in your fridge. That's when you sort of run your fingernail over the skin of a lemon. I neglected to have my lemon example here with me. But what you're ultimately doing is that you are scratching these globular trichomes that are on the surface of that lemon, and you are releasing limonene and essential oils that are on that particular surface. And the limonene has a particular lemony smell, but also it's pretty bitter. And so definitely you would think twice about munching onto a lemon, because you sort of understand that sort of irritant property that we have with some of these compounds. For alkaloids, these are stimulants and narcotics that have a wide range of human uses. Some are more and some are less acceptable in our particular society. But, these are compounds that, as you can see right through here, are sort of rich in nitrogen, if you kind of look at those particular products that we have right through there. And then we have our glucosinolates. And these are typical of a lot of our brassicas. And if you think about the glucosinolates, is that your mileage may vary, but there are some people who are particularly sensitive to to some of those compounds that we have within the mustardy sort of bite that we have with a lot of our brassicas. And really that sort of mustardy, peppery, almost irritant, if you will, is those sort of glucosinolates in those particular products. And the reason why we sort of think about the sort of defeating deterrent of these glucosinolates is that in separate cells, you have, or separate sort of areas that you have these glucosinolates stored next to the myrosinates. Now, separately, that they are sort of stable compounds. But once you sort of damage those particular cells, they start mixing. And what you end up having is that you start having the breakdown of those glucosinolates into products that are particularly toxic or distasteful. And, if you sort of look on the sort of side over here, that, maybe you recognize horseradish, very common mustard that has very strong, a strong sort of peppery sort of feel to, or wasabi is another one, where by itself, unmolested, it's pretty innocuous. But once you start chewing that material, you start breaking down those tissues, then what you have is that you have some of these distasteful products. And also what you get, as you can kind of see with this reaction down the bottom through here, is that you get that sort of classic sulfury smell that we see for those brassicas, because that sort of sulfur compound is just one of those sort of byproducts, that sort of off gases, if you will, from those glucosinolates. Now, because of those glucosinolates, because of those toxic compounds that are produced, quite a lot of herbivores, and some kids included, stay away from some of those brassicas. But then there are some that don't. Here we have our green peach aphid, and here we have our cabbage looper. They're fine with those types of plants. The reason why some insects are particularly tolerant is that they have figured out ways to get around this. So this is an example of the diamondback moth. And what the diamondback moth has, it has a particular enzyme that takes glucosinolates and sort of fractures off the sulfate group, as you see right through here, and effectively deactivating it so that morosinate no longer sort of has a ready partner that it can form some of these toxins, some of these toxins that we see right through here. And so therefore it has that sort of ability to munch on that particular tissue. Here we have an example of the cabbage worm. And what cabbage worm does is that it has a sort of a different pathway. It takes glucosinolates, and it has a specific nitrile specifying protein, as you kind of see through here, is that what it takes is it takes our glucosinolates and then directs it into a less toxic nitrile compound, as opposed to a more toxic compound, the isothiocyanate, which is something that is the normal sort of breakdown product. And so what the cabbage worm larva can potentially do is sort of control how much toxins are effectively sort of built up in its particular cells, and protect it against predators. Interestingly enough, is that here is our cabbage worm moth that we see right through here, is that the origin for this nitrile specifying protein goes back over 80 million years. And here is a relationship diagram for 4 different types of moths: the orange tip, the cabbage worm, the black veined white moth, and the tiny orange tip moth. And is that as they sort of fractured off and sort of speciated, is that some of these butterflies, some of these caterpillars ultimately lost some of their abilities to form the nitrile specifying protein, and some didn't. And so even though that they all would have had this sort of ability to do it at some point during that speciation process, that some of that was particularly lost. So for our insects, they have adapted to some of these secondary metabolites, and that's, in general, what the plant is looking for is trying to produce a secondary metabolite that is toxic, but that's not always been the case. All right, so I want to wrap things up here a little bit with a couple case studies to kind of look at some of these relationships that we've sort of circled around. Obviously, we're familiar with the milkweeds and the monarch butterflies. And, what we're sort of looking at here is that milkweed, the latex, has a particular alkaloid that contains within it. And normally, what this particular alkaloid does, it interferes with a certain protein that sort of functions in the movement of sodium and potassium across different ions. And so it basically sort of prevents sort of normal sort of cellular communicative function within insects that particularly consume those. Well, for our monarch butterflies, that they are insensitive to those types of things. And basically, as we sort of touched on previously, is that there is simply just an amino acid substitution that is different in that sort of target spot. That's potassium, sorry, the sodium potassium ATPase molecule. And once that product has been slightly changed, it works fine for our monarch butterflies, that the alkaloid no longer has the ability to act on it, and it is largely successful in growing even under high amounts of that particular amino acid. And as we're well aware, is that because of that accumulation of this alkaloid, that predators have learned to stay away. Now, obviously, we are familiar with the concept of mimicry, where the viceroy butterfly, it looks a lot like our monarch. And so it fools, some of our predators into thinking, well, I'll sort of stay away because you're sort of colored. But there are some predators who are particularly tolerant to the monarch's alkaloids. And we have the black-backed oriole, and we have the black-headed grosbeak, as you kind of see that these are wary to the sort of tricks of the accumulation of alkaloids. Well, we all also move that slide over. We also should sort of look at a little bit from our passion flower. We sort of talked a little bit about passion flower before, and oops, sorry about that. Is that passion flower has been studied for a long period of time, and it sort of formed the basis of some of our thoughts about mimicry. And so here we have our a sort of friend from previously that we sort of touched on here. So for our passion flower, is that it is producing the cyogenic glycoside. So it's going to be producing a compound that has the ability to be processed into cyanide. And as you can see, I have the sort of breakdown sort of process that we have right through here, is that through simple reactions that cyanide is ultimately produced. Well, what certain heliconus larvae can do is that they are specialized feeders, which they have certain reactions or certain modified reactions that can process and detoxify this cyanogenic glycoside, so it no longer contains the cyanide product that we have right through there. And so it's basically tolerant for those those secondary metabolites. Well, in sort of a countermeasure to those types of things, the passion flower goes through a certain sort of unique sort of feature, is that for some of those heliconus butterflies, so we had the zebra longwing on the previous example, and here's the Sarah longwing, is that for early newly emerged caterpillars, for some of our heliconus, they do sort of suffer cannibalism. And so what a female will typically want to do is lay their eggs on leaves that have eggs laid on previously. So therefore, to try to protect their offspring from potentially being cannibalized. Well, our passion flower, as you see right through here, makes what looks like fake egg laying spots. So to try to fool the Sarah longwing, as we see right through here, so that it doesn't lay its eggs or nearly as successfully on those leaves. All right. Last couple case studies that we have through here, we have aphids, whiteflies, and other phloem feeding insects. I mean, obviously, as we're sort of well aware, is that that these are particularly problematic phloem feeding insects to a lot of different crops, is that they are not only depleting crops of plants of resources, they're also potentially spreading diseases. And the way that they do that is they have, very similar to a mosquito, is that they have the ability to insert a needle-like mouth part directly into the phloem and extract resources through here. Well, as we sort of touched on, is that plants don't particularly want to lose hard-earned resources, and they have sort of natural mechanisms to plug up wounds. If a plant is damaged, it will sort of cordon off that area and prevent sort of further leaking and loss of resources. Well, again, similar to a mosquito, which can stop the coagulation of our blood as it extracts our blood after a bite, is that aphids and whiteflies and those types of phloem-sucking insects also have the ability to prevent those sort of natural wound healing abilities that we have in there. So, even though we have these sort of defense mechanisms, those insects do have the ability to counter them. So in a sort of general sort of sense, and our last sort of thoughts through here is that for our plants and herbivores is that they have either constitutive defenses that are always there, that are going to, sort of try to protect the plants, or, if they are trying to save costs in the long run, they will have some induced defenses and things that are trying to be manufactured as needed for those types of attacks. And obviously, as we sort of touched on, is that for nearly every sort of plant defense, there is a sort of certain countermeasure for those particular insects that have been built in there. Now, let's go back to our sort of first couple slides. And we sort of talked about this long-term complicated relationship with between wild tobacco and tobacco hornworm. Well, the tobacco hornworm is a specialist herbivore feeding on our wild tobacco. This sort of specialist feeder has the ability to sequester and secrete nicotine. So basically, the plants, what it could potentially do, it could simply try to increase the amount of nicotine that's produced. And that's pretty common. It's like, well, okay, I'm subject to feeding damage. I'm going to respond by increasing my defenses. And, much more simply is that's going to be selecting for insects that are much better at sequestering and secreting those nicotines, those nicotine alkaloids. But also, as we sort of touched on, is that the tobacco hornworm is also, at least the adult, is also the main pollinator. So it sort of begs the question is that, if this particular insect is either foe or friend or frenemy, like how do you balance these conflicting relationships? What does a plant ultimately do? Well, if there is an increased amount of feeding damage, if there is a power shift, that there's far more feeding damage than what that plant's, the wild tobacco, can particularly put up with, what it can start doing, it can start shifting when flowers are open. So if under feeding damage or heavy feeding damage, what the wild tobacco typically does is start to flower at night. And start to flower in the morning, and our adult moths are typically active at night. And so if those moths are no longer successful into pollinating, because they are, there's just not as much sort of nectar being harvested. They're not getting as much resources. They're probably not laying enough eggs. So, they're typically slowing down populations. Well, what we have through here is that we have already resources that hummingbirds have sort of stepped into. And so now we have a shift of pollinators. So in the response to this sort of delicate dance is that we have this sort of a resource that's been taken up by someone else in that that sort of ecosystem. So final thoughts is that if we wanted to look at where we go from here, if we are looking to try to find more herbivore tolerant plants, we should sort of really sort of come to terms with the fact that some of these defense compounds that we've talked about, that they can be toxic to humans. And for plants, they are costly to manufacture. It is not a free ride. And that's a reason why we see some plants only make some things and not all things. Now, during the domestication process, is that we have intentionally selected out these defense compounds, and they were lost, either deliberately or not, during those during the last 10,000 years of us domesticating plants and going into sort of agriculture. So what we need to sort of shift to is to sort of try to sort of kickstart some of those natural and inducible mechanisms to try to get some of those defense mechanisms back into those plants to make them more herbivore resistant, and we also, form more alliances with some of our predators so that we can have them take some of the load off of us. And so the more we can understand about, how these reactions or how these interactions sort of play out, the better off we'll be as far as, kind of moving more towards our sort of future and that sort of thing. All right, so I will exit my presentation through there.
Thanks.
And, there we go. And I will
Thank you,
stop
Kris.
sharing. There we go. We're back.
Thank you, Kris.
Oh, no problem.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation. So we do have a few questions that came in, and
Yes.
just a quick reminder, if there is a question in the Q&A box, give that a thumbs up and we will prioritize those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and begin. Rebecca asked, is this decline in toxicity over the life of the plant related to the plant's nutritional value, or is it related to leaves forming harder cuticles as a physical barrier against herbivory?
If that's referring to the early slide that talked about the cherry and the sorghum, I mean, you can look at it as definitely a decrease in nutritional quality because the nitrogen content was declining with the age of those leaves. But also, in what's kind of replacing the declining of nutrients, if you're just sort of using nitrogen as your baseline, you're also sort of, those tissues are becoming firmer, harder, lignified, if you will. And so they ultimately become sort of less palatable as well. So, the general strategy is to try to protect the most vulnerable. And so, for those early seedlings, the new buds that are emerging, the new flowers, and that, for that sort of represent the that year's sort of fruits, well, those would be the things that you want to protect early on and protect quite hard, and to sort of ride out potential damage so that you don't really have to worry about damage later on. It's detrimental, but it's not as so.
Great, thank you. Kathleen asked, you mentioned that subsequent generations of plants become better at defending themselves because of the communication from the older generation of plants. Does that also apply to herbivorous insects that become more tolerant of toxins produced by the plants?
Yes, it does. It is. If it was just a one and done, it would be a great success story. But again, since since the plants are figuring out, okay, I have to defend myself more, then the insects that have realized, oh, there's more defense mechanisms, then I will sort of do whatever it is that I do to try to overcome those types of things. And so this sort of Cold War, this sort of back and forth is going to constantly shift forward, and that the insects that are successful and the plants that are successful or more successful, they're the ones that are going to kind of keep going forward, and it keeps kind of ratcheting up the those processes as time goes on.
Yeah, thanks. And then you mentioned this, a question came in about the relationship between the monarch butterflies and the milkweed plants, and you probably answered that through those slides. But how is there anything in addition to add to how that system works, since the sap of the milkweed is poison?
Well, yeah, it's so latex. Latex is a function of, it's like almost like a wound healing sort of mechanism. So like, if there was damage to the plant, then it's forming that sort of plant scab on there. And so milkweed tries to deter damage by having not only some of that latex, which is sticky and not very pleasant to be on, it also has those particular alkaloids in there. And so you're going to have some sort of specialist herbivore that's going to have to, one, sort of figure out how do I deal with the latex. And that was the example where we had the munching of the veins to prevent latex from being delivered, but then also has to sort of do something to process the alkaloids that are contained within them. So the monarch butterfly, just by having just a slight alteration in the sort of the lock, the key no longer sort of fits in there. The alkaloid really doesn't do what it's supposed to do, which is try to prevent the success of insects that are munching on it.
Great. And then we do have a few more questions. I'm not too sure what we okay to take a few more questions, Claudia?
Yeah, we can take a few more questions. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. So one of the earlier questions from Kathleen asked, how long does it take for the parasitic wasp eggs to kill the tobacco hornworms?
Oh, okay. When you have, I didn't show the video because it is pretty gross, but there are some videos out there where you can have it's the parasitoid that has been sort of laid on there, and once they've been have heavy egg laying on there, that's whatever little sort of maggoty has been creature has been sort of immersed in there. It's going to be going through and going to be munching into the tobacco hornworm and also the tomato hornworm and other types of things, and it's going to be sort of consuming it from the inside out. With a high population or a high number of eggs laid on it, you're going to have probably a much more quicker kill that we have on there than we would if you had maybe one or two. Still that having an internal parasite is not going to be good for that tobacco hornworm, and it's eventually going to kick the bucket in there.
Great. And I'm going to ask this question, and perhaps there's a learning moment for myself in this question. Anja asked, what is the brackets? And that's where the question comes in of what brackets she's referring to of cyanide in the seeds of sorghum and black cherry.
Okay. Yeah. So in sorghum,
concentration. That's
the concentration. Okay, what's the concentration? Well, what's the concentration of it? Well, in the graphic that we had on the black cherry and the sorghum, If I go back to that particular slide, it was in parts per million. And oopsie doopsie. Let's see, to share screen again. We'll go back into there. We'll go to the front. There we go. Yeah, so we were looking at concentrations of, oh, I didn't want to do that. There we go. We were looking at concentrations of 4,200 parts per million versus 2,500 parts per million, which is still, it's still not a lot. You know, it is a deterrent, you know, in things like from the previous slide, you know, from, you know, cherry or apricot or apple or those types of things. Yes, they do have the building blocks for cyanide that we have in there. But with anything, it's the dose that makes the particular poison. Obviously, as a human being, you know, we have a much larger body mass. So we would have to consume a fair amount of the apple seeds, as an example, in order to, you know, really have that sort of cyanide poisoning. I don't know how much that particularly is. I probably should know this because I do know some people in my life who do particularly like to eat the entirety of the apple, seeds included, but swallowing a few seeds here or there is not going to kill you. You're talking about quite a bit.
Okay, good to know. And then, so has anyone looked at how climate change will impact plants' chemical defense systems?
It was this close to having a climate change slide in there, but I thought, yeah. Okay, so the long story short is that if you think about where climate change is going to be impacting, so it's going to be impacting the temperature for sure. So you're going to be looking at insects that are developing much more quickly and becoming more active more quickly. So the potential, obviously, there is going to be you know, more voracious insects as we sort of move forward. You could also potentially look at insects that are coming from areas that are, you know, sort of no longer sort of constrained by cooler temperatures and those types of things. So now you have sort of new pests jumping into the fray. And so we don't have the potential for a long-term sort of relationship. You sort of have this sort of thrown together sort of new player in the mix that doesn't have this sort of the natural predator check and balance that we see in here. So what we could potentially see is that some of these long-term relationships, you know, that they'll probably get thrown out of whack quite a bit as we sort of move forward with climate change. And I really think that's where we will have to sort of, you know, from one of my last sort of slides, is that we'll have to sort of uncrack the sort of the mystery of, you know, some of these natural defense compounds that are sort of inherent within our plants, that they have this sort of ability. They can defend themselves. They have the ability. We just don't necessarily allow them to in a lot of cases. You know, through some of breeding and domestication, if we can sort of come back and sort of bring in some of those natural defenses, they could probably withstand some of that onslaught that we could potentially see as going forward. But that's a good question, and it is one that's kind of, it's hard to say, and it's probably not going to be good.
Yeah. So I believe this will be the last question. Can you please review the induced defense response using salicylic acid again?
Okay. So like so like the induced responses, so they would, for things like our jasmonic acid, for ethylene and salicylic acid, they could be sort of parts of a sort of a alarm system that is potentially sent out via a volatile organic compounds that could be sort of, that can be, you can think of as gases that could sort of move out to different parts of the plant or to different plants in and of themselves. And in some of those responses with salicylic acid, as an example, can help with some of those defense responses that we see with our pathogens, which is going to be some of our topics that we'll have for our next class period, or sort of next lecture period, if you will. And so we'll sort of visit salicylic acid again when we talk about some of the defense responses that plants sort of do to kind of bolster some of their attacks from the front of a pathogen. So we'll put a pin in that, because we'll have to view that next time.
Great. A great segue for closing statements for Kate.
Yes.
And Kate, do you want to finish up? Thank you very much, Shayla. You did that's Shayla's first Q&A that she's done for us. She's one of our brand new Master Gardeners in the Halton group. So very well done.
Oh, thank you very much. That was fascinating. Can't wait for the next one. Can't imagine how long it took for all those relationships to build up.
It does take a while.
100 million years or whatever you mentioned. And it's like really interesting. And most likely our summer workshop will be a go. At least we're really crossing our fingers. So whoever signs up, of course, as I said, you can spend an entire day with Kris discussing various insect topics. I'm not exactly sure.
We'll probably revisit some of these things we talked about, as far as trying to read the signs as far as what kind of damage you're seeing and what was potentially doing it. So
yeah, so it'll be a really good workshop for sure. Also, thanks very much to Claudette, of course, and Janet and Shaylee. It was really wonderful. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up, please do so. We have 2 more presentations. Daryl and Kris both dealing with part 2, so that will be coming. And I was just going to mention very briefly last time, but then we had our issues, and I'll just briefly mention it, Claudette, and then if you want to expand, go right ahead. I just wanted to mention the Canadian Coalition for Invasive Plant Regulations, led by Kathy and strongly supported, of course, by Claudette, which was formed in January. Is in a response to the outcry by the public on the Master Gardeners of Ontario Facebook. Their main objective, of course, is to protect the land and water from invasive plant species. And at this point, they are working on creating a logo and a website design using a team of artists and web designers. If you are interested, please read the February newsletter, MGOI newsletter. There's an article there, and Kathy's email. Kathy's email address is there if you are interested. Did you want to expand on that, Claudette?
I put the link in the web the chat, and just before we go, hopefully, Kris, you take a look at the chat before you go. But lots of great comments. The structure and lecture was well organized and communicated. I think that's a teacher really wants to hear that, and many other wonderful. Oh, when we have a cat with us.
Yeah, and he left me alone for the entirety of the presentation, so he knew when it was done.
That's unusual.
No, that was excellent. So much information. That was wonderful. So thanks to everybody who attended tonight, and Kris, great evening.
I think that was your best presentation. I loved that, Kris.
That was really good.
Oh, thank you.
And we can watch it again, right?
Yes.
There we go.
Oh, video. We gotta
Yeah,
stop-
for
stop
sure.
the video.